for coming. Can everyone hear me over the music outside? And thanks to our pasty friends outside as well. Nothing better to do on Friday night than bang on a library window to try to stop women from speaking. For my entire life, I was not just left-wing, but I was the most left-wing, and I was proud of that. I grew up in a Marxist household. I attended strikes and union meetings with my dad, who worked for Canada Post for many years and was active in the labor movement. Can you guys still hear me okay? Okay. We were passionately dedicated to the NDP, which was Canada's then socialist party. They since removed the word socialism from their constitution, which I considered a pathetic betrayal. We considered even the Liberal Party too far right for us. I supported public health care, universal daycare, social housing, a higher minimum wage, student debt relief, even free post-secondary education, and universal basic income. For most of my life, I considered rich people to be bad. These are our allies on the left, here to support marginalized communities. I considered property ownership to be unethical, and anyone who wasn't as left as me to be either apathetic, evil, stupid, unethical, or uneducated. I thought that sometimes violent revolution was necessary if it meant a change to the system, empowering the downtrodden, and undoing all the injustice I saw in the world. The world was divided up into good people and bad people. The bad people, the bourgeoisie, could be destroyed in our quest for a better, kinder, less violent, more just world. As I got older, I softened my approach. I didn't think that it was necessary to tear down the system, whatever that means. I realized I have no idea what smashing the patriarchy or smashing capitalism looks like in real life, and began to suspect that no one else did either. As I started to speak to and listen to different kinds of people who weren't ideologically and politically committed to radical feminism and socialism, I started to wish that those around me would do the same. I felt frustrated that my so-called allies were siloed by choice, completely disconnected from anyone who thought differently than they did. They treated anyone who didn't agree with their political analysis as not just bad, but dangerous. Even to speak to these people, never mind share platforms with them, befriend them, read their work, or try to understand them, invite them to conversations on our platforms, was dangerous and unethical. Somebody might accidentally change their mind. We couldn't have that. Independent thought was dangerous, questioning was dangerous, men who are feminists were dangerous, Trump was definitely dangerous, as was anyone who voted for him. I cried when Hillary Clinton lost the election in 2016. And I wasn't even that big of a Hillary fan. She was obviously a neoliberal. Not left enough for me, that's for sure. The idea that she lost to somebody as odious as Trump was too much for me to bear. How could America hate women so much? I wrote at that time that Hillary wasn't widely reviled because of her politics, but because she was female. And that she was hated in specifically sexist ways. I wrote that she lost because she was a woman. And while it may have been true that some people did hate her because she was a woman, there were a lot of other reasons people didn't vote for her beyond that. But at the time I didn't get it. I just could not possibly understand why anyone would vote for Trump instead of Hillary. And up until a few years ago, until after that election, it wasn't just that I didn't understand Trump supporters, it was that I didn't understand the right at all. I didn't understand conservative values. I had spent my whole life not wanting to understand. It was way easier to just write people off. And to treat my worldview as inarguably correct. Those who didn't understand just needed to be re-educated. When Trump won, after I was done messy crying, I started reading and listening to those who had explanations. And those explanations actually made a lot of sense. It wasn't just bad, rich white men, the worst of all people, who voted for Trump. It was working class people, immigrants, even women. People who didn't like Hillary, sure, but also people who had come to realize that the Democrats weren't working for them, and frankly, didn't even care about them. The working class people who had once been the focal point of the left, back when the left was about class and empowering the working class, had not only been forgotten by progressives, but were treated with derision. Identity politics had shifted the left's focus on practical matters like workers' rights, enabling people to live with dignity and autonomy, ensuring people could care for their families, civil rights and liberties, even democracy. In both Canada and the US, progressives appeared more focused on virtue signaling their support for Black Lives Matters and trans rights than on what was actually happening in the real lives of women, immigrants, and the working class. Real life had been replaced by hyperbolic tweets, hashtags, and hot takes. The left attached itself to nonsense ideas like abolishing the police, which would probably help these guys out, so fair enough. And defending the so-called rights of men to access women's washrooms, change rooms, and transition houses. They declared that people needed abortions, not women, as of course men can get pregnant too. The movement that was once in opposition to the bourgeoisie had become the elite and lost connection with people different than they. Overeducated urban, middle, and upper-class people were pontificating about the marginalizing universities, in the media, and online, but seemed to not actually know any marginalized people beyond their non-binary friend, who now needed everyone to refer to them as they under threat of suicide. People claiming to be anti-fascist started acting like fascists. People accusing everyone else, including myself, of bigotry were behaving like bigots. People calling themselves feminists were no longer protecting women's rights. The left had behaved hatefully towards me for many years. They petitioned to have me fired and no platform. They claimed I was every single kind of phobic. They lied about it and misrepresented my positions. They blacklisted me and broadly treated me as some kind of pariah. Even reading my work was cause for ousting among activist circles in Canada. If you were on the left in Canada, you had to hate me. Despite my many years of dedication to feminism, I was treated similarly by many feminists. They called me whorephobic and said that I hated sex workers on account of my opposition to the sex trade and believed that prostitution was probably not good for women. I knew women in the sex trade who had exited, and I knew the reality of what women endured in prostitution, and despite the fact that it should be obvious to anyone with a brain and a heart that prostitution is a soul-killing, abusive, dangerous, actually misogynist industry that no healthy person would choose unless they had little to no other choice, most mainstream feminists didn't want to hear the realities of these women, the women that I knew, preferring to defer to the escorts of Twitter, who couldn't possibly be claiming the industry was a wonderful place because they needed clients to think so and needed to continue making a living in the industry. It was once accepted by feminists at least that pornography degraded and dehumanized women, but with the advent of third-wave feminism, porn had become a means to empower women. Criticizing the porn industry or the men who used and produced pornography was reframed over and over again as sex negative. I was labeled prudish, sex-hating, and told that I must be a member of the religious right, which is weird because not only have I been an atheist for my whole life, I didn't even know any Christians. I've never cracked the Bible, and the idea of going to church seems like hell, to be honest. The full 180 came along with Bill C-16, Canada's gender identity legislation. I had begun following the debate around transgenderism and women's spaces a few years prior, but I didn't consider it a particularly serious matter until I saw feminists, my friends, so mostly radical second-wave women, being attacked, platformed, censored, and libeled for questioning the notion that men could become women and should have access to women's spaces on that basis. Once legislation was introduced to further entrench those ideas, I knew it was really time to fight. I worried that Bill C-16, which aimed to amend the Canadian Human Rights Act and the Criminal Code to add gender identity and gender expression to the list of prohibited grounds of discrimination, would pose a risk to sex-based protections for women and girls. I pointed out that the media had framed the debate around gender identity as one of left versus right, leaving out an actual feminist perspective, or even considering what regular, non-politicized people thought of all this. In reality, of course, very few people buy the idea of a female penis. I fought so hard to speak about this anywhere I could. I pitched to every publication I could. No one wanted to hear it. The narrative had been decided. All progressive people believe men could become women on pronouncement, and to say otherwise constituted hate speech. The only people, supposedly, who opposed gender identity, ideology, and legislation were the religious right, who we were told also hated gay people, people of color, immigrants, women, so on and so forth. These things were all settled. Thankfully, I had my own platform at Feminist Current to write about my concerns, and I finally did manage to convince an editor of mine at a Canadian publication to publish me on this. And as a result, I was invited to testify against Bill C-16 at the Senate by a conservative senator. My leftist party refused to speak to me about this. My MP, who I knew, refused to speak to me about this. Even to have, a conversation. They didn't want to hear it at all. So, people criticize us for speaking with conservatives, conservative politicians, for allying with the right. I don't know who else we're supposed to talk to. Local unions started blacklisting women who expressed concerns about gender identity legislation or who challenged the accepted mantras. Leftist activists harassed, threatened, and ostracized anyone who didn't toe the line. They graffitied the storefront of a local transition house and stuffed dead rodents in their mailbox because they wouldn't buy in. Women started to attempt to try to organize events where I and other women could speak about our concerns. Venues pulled out, protesters showed up to harass and threaten attendees. I was subject to death threats and endless slander by media I had written for and done interviews with. The mayor of Vancouver, who I voted for, referred to me as despicable in public. Friends ghosted me or told me they couldn't associate with me anymore. I needed private bodyguards simply to speak basic truths about biology. Not only was I appalled by the irrationality and hypocrisy of the new left, but I wanted the freedom to think and speak for myself. And progressives and most feminists honestly opposed this, trying to force me back into their preferred box. When I started to speak out in defense of free speech and civil liberties, of due process, against cancel culture, I was accused by my allies of things like racism and allying with the right. I had had enough. I didn't want to be aligned with authoritarians and people opposed to independent thought. I began to see many of these people as being more invested in control than in telling the truth and in doing what's right, regardless of where that places you on the political spectrum. So finally, after decades of devotion, I gave up on the left and saw it for what it was, not what I wished it to be, and I left. And while at many times my experience was sad and hurtful and definitely maddening, in the end, my transformation and move away from ideologies and political labels was freeing. I want to listen, to learn, to understand, not to chant empty mantras. I want to think for myself. I want to support the best policies and practices for real people, not those that will get the most likes on Twitter. I know it can seem scary to part with your tribe, but in the end, it is empowering and it's liberating, and it allows you to become a more authentic person, a more resilient person, and a person who is free to speak the truth, which I promise is more valuable than any friend, political alliance, job, or tweet.
Evans. Michelle is a mother of 3, a fierce advocate for families and freedom, and one of the founding members of Texans for Vaccine Choice. There's more. So after Michelle was blindsided with trans ideology in her home and her kids' schools, she began learning more about this pervasive and disruptive movement. As a state legislative candidate, she hopes to introduce measures to protect children from harmful medical procedures and social conditioning.
I did not take time to prepare anything like the other panelists here, so I'm just going to kind of wing it, and it may not last the whole 10 minutes. But if you can't hear me at any time, please just... Okay, so Mark can't hear me. Good. I was raised by a very strong woman who is here tonight, so you should applaud her. And while in no formal way did I ever identify as a feminist, and definitely never identified as a liberal or a leftist, I wanted to be a part of this event because I think that if we don't have these difficult conversations, if we don't reach out to people who don't necessarily think 100% like us 100% of the time, we're lost. We will lose this fight that's happening right outside these windows. Like Isabella said, I am one of the founding members of Texans for Vaccine Choice, and that sort of came about organically in 2015 after I had considered myself a little bit politically homeless. We were bombarded with about 15 bills that legislative session that would have restricted vaccine choice rights or invaded your medical privacy in some way, and me and a group of other really pissed off moms got together and thought, we have to stop this. We didn't know a damn thing about legislation. We didn't know even who our legislators were. So I spent almost every day of that session, and she can attest to that, going to the Capitol, testifying at hearings, and reaching out to each and every legislator that I could to try to just tell our stories and get them to understand that this is a very fundamental right to not have to put something in your body that you disagree with for any particular reason. And I found at that time that there was a huge barrier of entry at almost every single Democrat legislator's door. They didn't want to hear our personal stories. They didn't want to hear about rights. They didn't want to hear about liberty, the Constitution, none of that. They were, with very few exceptions, they wrote us off as murderers, maniacs, anti-vaxxers. So I quickly understood that I had to align with a party in some way in order to get anything done. And we wound up teaming up with the most conservative legislators during that session and killed all of that legislation with no help from the left. And so after that, I veered between parties, never really saying like I'm a card-carrying Republican, even though I was raised in a fairly Republican household. I discovered libertarianism and thought that was the way to go. And then, you say there's a victimless crime. So if somebody's doing fentanyl on the street, that's not my problem, that's their choice. If somebody is selling sex on the street, it's not my problem, that's their choice. But recently it's become so clear to me that none of these ideas of, it's a victimless crime or it doesn't do any harm to our society. Obviously, that's not the case. And there's a fundamental need for the government in some way to protect my rights, your rights, your rights. That's what they're there to do. And if somebody is, sorry, I feel distracted. But if somebody is selling or is being made to sell sex on the street or being coerced into porn or being coerced into trans ideology, that's obviously, it's imperative that we need to address it. Now, Isabella also alluded to the trans ideology kind of creeping into my home. I have a teenage daughter who is like every teenage daughter, trying to figure herself out in this world, trying to find out where she belongs. And one day she came home and pushed a button across the kitchen island to me, and it said, "My pronouns are they, them." And I'd never really even thought about it before that. But immediately my instinct was to say, no, that's not happening. I know who you are. I created you. I raised you. I birthed you. I've seen it all. And I know that you cannot change the perfect person that you are, and I wouldn't want you to. And while she struggled a little bit after that, she's now so comfortable in herself, for the most part. She's an adolescent girl, so it's not 100%, but she knows those boundaries. She knows what reality is. She knows what truth is. And I've seen this bullet train of mistruth happening. I don't want to use the term misinformation, just complete mistruth, a disconnect from reality. So things that you say are harmful to me. If you don't wear a mask, you're trying to kill me. If you don't get a vaccine, you're going to kill your grandmother. You can't go see your dying aunt in the hospital. It's gotten so extreme in the last couple of years, and then this buildup of gender ideology has just become, for me, possibly the most dangerous societal problem that we have right now, particularly for women and girls. And to think that a man or a biological boy has the right to trample on a girl's consent is going to harm generations of women, without a doubt for me. I don't care about somebody's feelings when it comes to that. And that's not to sound harsh. You can do whatever you want to do in your own space, but you don't have the right to come into my daughter's space and push her or require her to believe that you are something that is not true. So as somebody who still works and still speaks to, on a regular basis, very conservative legislators in Texas, some of the most conservative people you'll probably ever meet. In fact, I was at dinner with some last night. I feel like they're saying the same thing that Megan and other panelists and other high-profile TERFs are saying. That, I was listening to an interview with one today, and he was saying, you've got drag queens dancing in front of children, and it's not like these drag queens are putting on, they're putting on Susan B. Anthony costumes. They're taking the most hypersexualized, unrealistic version of women and trying to make that like their woman costume. And they're taking dollar bills from children in bars. And that to me it's a huge problem. I was just talking to somebody the other day that, pardon me for saying this, but drag queen is the new blackface. I don't understand how people cannot be offended by the most misogynistic interpretation of women being perpetuated by men. So I'd like to, as a Republican, bridge the gap. I want to be the person that talks to Lesbians United and, is not afraid to engage with people that perhaps a lot of conservatives are hesitant to get in touch with or to talk to. I think that it's important for us to not be led by somebody like Matt Walsh. I think we need to tell our own stories, and if that means that I am locking arms with a Marxist or a former Marxist, I'm more than happy to do so. So I just want to thank everyone here for coming, because you truly were courageous to come and stay and tolerate this noise. So I really, really thank every single one of you guys for being here, and you ladies for being here. And I hope that this is a groundbreaking of sorts, that we can get past some of the labels and just start to really work effectively together as women and the men that support us.
Our next speaker is Keri Smith. Keri is the host of Deprogrammed and the founder of Civility Dinners, both of which are committed to fostering conversation, creating a culture that respects freedom of speech, and making space for both reason and faith. A liberal and self-described former social justice warrior who spent 20 years in the social justice warrior cult, Keri offers firsthand experience on the social justice left and its growing influence in mainstream culture.
So bear with me, my heart rate's just a little bit elevated, I don't know why. I'm going to try to speak loudly enough that you can hear me. And I have prepared some notes, and I'll try to go off of them once in a while, but my name is Keri Smith. I'm the host of Deprogrammed, which is a podcast where we examine the differences between social justice ideology, which is my old belief system, and liberalism. A little about my background and my story of leaving the left. I do have a lot of similarities with Megan, and also some interesting differences. I was indoctrinated into social justice ideology over 20 years ago at Duke University. And I like to say that some people enter the social justice tent through the race door, and some enter it through the sexuality door, and some enter it through the fat door, and some enter it through the mental health justice door, and there's an environmentalism door, and I came in through the feminist door. But once you get in, it's all the same. Intersectionality is what they call it. So, I was a biological anthropology and anatomy major, but a women's studies minor. This was back before women's studies became a problematic term, and they've renamed it gender studies. I was encouraged to cherry pick any experiences I had had with sexism, and of course there were some, to recast my past with the lens of finding the sexism in everything. So I began to see myself as part of an oppressed minority and as part of a marginalized group. Up until that point in my life, I don't think my identity, when I thought of myself, I didn't characterize myself so much with like woman way up at the top. I hadn't done that until then. The best way that I've found to describe my old ideology is as a mutated form of Marxism, wedded to postmodernism. So whereas the Marxism of the early 20th century told us that the best way to look at the world is as a struggle for wealth between class groups, this kind of mutated form of Marxism says, no, the best way to look at the world is as a struggle for power among identity groups. And so people who are in it, they obsessively divide everyone into identity groups based on race, sex, sexuality, and this is why you see new ones forming all the time. Size, mental health, like how many ways can you be oppressed, right? Or the oppressor. So that's similar to Marxism in that they believe in order to reach equality that we have to redistribute power among identity groups. Whereas Marxists felt it was more about redistributing wealth, right, among class groups. So in order to redistribute power among these different identity groups, unfortunately that requires us to judge and treat people differently on the basis of which of these groups they're in. So surprise, kind of turns you into a racist and a sexist. In social justice, I learned to judge people not as individuals, not by the content of their character, not by their behavior or the merit of their ideas. No, I learned to judge and treat people differently on the basis of their race, their sex, their sexuality, their gender, their size, and more. And it's not very different from white supremacy in this way, because both are collectivists instead of being individualists. Both say that we should judge and treat people differently because of race. Both believe that the Enlightenment values of liberty, equality, and meritocracy are a function of whiteness. One of the best illustrations of these similar beliefs was the whiteness poster put out in 2020 by the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, in which they said individualism, objectivity, rational thinking, the scientific method, hard work, the nuclear family, progress, respect for authority, delayed gratification, and being on time were all parts of whiteness and white culture. Critical race theory is just one part of this belief system, of course, and one that's thankfully come under scrutiny this past year. It tells us that racism is embedded in every structure, every system, and every part of our culture, and that we shouldn't ask if racism has occurred, but how it has occurred. Feminism, as it's been now incorporated into social justice, tells us the same thing about sexism. Gender theory tells us the same thing about transphobia. One of the things that people who have lost family members to this cult have shared with me is how big the hearts are of their loved ones. And I don't need to be convinced of this because I know it's true. Social justice warriors can be divided into two groups of people as far as I'm concerned. There are those in it with good intent, and there are those in it with bad. The ones with good intent and big hearts are in it because they truly believe it's an ideology meant to end bigotry. These people outside, they think they're doing something good. And there's a disconnect because if you go out and stand with them, as I did for a second, they're filled with so much hatred and vitriol. But see, a cult can cause you to lose connection with yourself, where you can literally stand outside and scream and try to stop people from having a conversation and still think you're doing it in the service of good, right? Like the ends justify the means because they think their ends are good. So they'll do anything for those just ends. That's a really dangerous thing. So there are people in it with good intent. And when I call this ideology evil, I do so not because it's racist and sexist, not just because of that, but because it takes well-intentioned people and it turns them into foot soldiers for the very things they think they're opposing. And then there are those... And then there are those who are in it with bad intent, on the other hand. These are the con artists. There are con artists in every ideology. There's even con artists in anti-woke. And those are the people who are in it to use it as a means to acquire power, wealth, or fame. It's like the people who are at the top, kind of pushing this ideology, making a lot of money off it, they're kind of like the modern televangelists, is the way I think of them. This latter group doesn't care about ending oppression, they just want to be the ones doing the oppressing. So how do the architects of this ideology, those with bad intent, convince well-meaning people to start judging and treating people differently based on identity if they oppose racism and sexism? They have to change the definitions of those words. Cults and authoritarians are very concerned with controlling our language because through language they can control the way we think, and by controlling the way we think they can control us. This is something that Orwell wrote about all the time. One of the first and most important redefinitions that I learned in social justice and that you may have learned is that racism and sexism mean prejudice plus power. And they tell us that we have to redefine it that way so that we have a way of talking about systemic and institutionalized racism and sexism. That's not true. We already have a way to refer to those things. It's called institutionalized and systemic racism and sexism. Like there's already, you could just call it that. But they're trying to redefine those words, and what's the effect of that? What's the effect of that when you teach children that essentially it's impossible to be racist towards a certain race, or it's impossible to be sexist towards this sex over here because they don't have power? Like, could anything possibly go wrong with teaching generations of kids that racism is impossible? depending on what color you are. Like, I don't know, it blows my mind when I think about it. This ideology would not stop with just redefining those words. One only needs to turn on the news or listen to politicians on the left to realize it's now impossible to define woman, apparently, or mother. Changing and discarding commonly accepted definitions is not their only tactic. The high priests of the movement who work in academia are constantly coining new terms to stigmatize groups of people or to control the way in which we think about things. So phrases like white privilege, white fragility, toxic masculinity, mansplaining, chest feeder, birthing person, and menstruator have all made the jump from college campuses to the mainstream in the past few years. And now we're watching as major corporations and banks lecture us with a variety of those pseudo-intellectual and Orwellian phrases, and we're supposed to believe that this out here is the resistance supported by McDonald's and Amazon and Netflix and United Airlines. So I think I might be able to try to wrap this up. When people ask me, how did you leave the cult, what woke you up? It's hard to put into words that part of it required, for me, a complete breakdown of my sense of self and my identity. Again, all of this is wrapped up in identity. An awakening is not like it's sold to us in brochures for expensive yoga and meditation retreats on the beach. I did not achieve enlightenment while doing a downward dog under a rainbow in paradise. My awakening required a death of the self and a dark descent into hell and back, and a grappling with the big questions about the purpose of life and who I am and what I believe and how I want to behave. And I'll tell you, I don't want to behave like these people out here, even when I oppose them. So in my case, I stumbled down a rabbit hole on YouTube of videos of people on the left who are supposedly on my side doing stuff like this and attacking Trump voters and throwing eggs at them and throwing bricks at them and bloodying them, and it left me an emotional wreck because I didn't know that was happening. And I think that's the way that people wake up from cults, is it's something emotional that gets to you first, because the facts and stuff can't penetrate that. I didn't wake up overnight, it was a slow process. When Trump won in 2016, I was devastated, like many of my tribe, like Megan. If I had known Megan back then, we could have cried together. But I became very concerned with understanding why he won, and I started engaging with thinkers, with speakers, with writers that I had never engaged with before, like actually reading their books or listening to what they had to say. Some of these people were conservatives, and I found that I disagreed with them on some things, and I agreed with them on others, but mostly the biggest thing was that I came to understand their arguments instead of just believing that I did. I started posing questions online, like, is it considered liberal to now support censorship? Is it liberal now to support violence against those with whom we disagree? Like in any cult, questioning the dogma is strongly discouraged, and often you will get mobbed, publicly shamed by your fellow allies. As I often say, SJWs don't have friends, they have allies. And as soon as they realize you're now engaging in independent thought, they'll come to see you as a heretic, and sometimes they'll even pick up a pitchfork and join the mob that comes for you. I had a friend who flew to Texas and tried to do an ideological intervention on me, and told me that I wasn't just leaving the tribe, that I was joining another tribe, that I was joining the right. And I just want to tell you, if you're in this room, that's not true. If you're someone who's thinking of leaving the left, or you're even questioning it, it's a false binary to think you have two options. This whole right-left thing, the right-left binary is false. It keeps us at each other's throats. It prevents us from having conversations and understanding each other better. It causes this kind of stuff that's happening. You don't have to stop being a liberal if you leave the left. In fact, opposing authoritarianism, racism, sexism, violence, censorship, those things are liberal. And you don't have to become a conservative, although it's still legal to become one. It's okay. So if you're here tonight, I just want to say I'm really excited to be a part of this with you guys in Austin and with all these beautiful ladies on the stage. And we didn't all end up in the same place. We have different opinions on politics, policy, religion. Even last night we found out we disagree on Amber Heard and Johnny Depp. Like, we don't have to agree on everything. And so if you're thinking of speaking up or asking questions, like, don't let fear stop you, because one day there might be a time where you're not allowed to ask questions anymore. So I'd say do it now. And I told Michelle I was going to end with this. If we want to turn this crazy tide around, in the words of Vanilla Ice, we need to stop, collaborate, and listen.
That was awesome, Keri. Our final speaker is Mary Lou Singleton. Mary Lou is a mother, a midwife, a nurse practitioner, and medical freedom activist. We've got a lot of those here tonight. Mary Lou has served on the boards of directors for the Midwives Alliance of North America, the National Association of Certified Professional Midwives, the Stop Patriarchy Abortion Rights Freedom Ride, and the Women's Liberation Front. She has been speaking out against female erasure in midwifery since 2014 and is the author of an open letter to the Midwives Alliance of North America protesting the removal of the words woman and mother from the organization's core competency for midwives documents.
Michelle, after your talk, I'm thinking I want to add high-profile turf to my bio. I'm just going to embrace it. Thank you all for coming. I'm just really thrilled to be here with this dynamic group of women. And I just want to honor everybody's bravery for being here. I know it's scary to stand up for your truth in the face of people who want to silence you, and I'm glad everybody came. And I know it's Pride Month, so I want to take this opportunity to come out of the closet. I am politically non-binary. After considering myself a leftist for most of my life since adolescence, I no longer identify with any of the assigned political categories. So don't box me, all right? I'm leaving the left for many reasons, but for this event I want to focus on what I see happening in healthcare and how I see leftist ideology infiltrating medicine, and that this is harming the healthcare system and the health of our population. I am a midwife, an independent nurse practitioner, and a small business owner. My clinic, Enchanted Family Medicine, provides primary healthcare services to over 2,000 patients in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Living in a Democrat-controlled state over the past 2.5 years has been a painful lesson for me on the meaning of the often repeated conservative phrase, government overreach. Watching the government effectively suspend the First Amendment by banning gatherings of friends and family, criminalizing church services, policing the speech of medical providers who disagreed with any aspect of the COVID response, and banning unvaccinated citizens from entering government buildings was chilling. When I voiced concerns about cloth masking and presented studies showing the ineffectiveness of cloth masks against airborne respiratory viruses, I was told by a prominent Democrat in my community that I was being irresponsible with my right to speak freely. When I publicly stated that people had good reasons to be wary of mRNA vaccine technology, which was only approved for human use in 2020, I was called anti-science. When I explained that there was nothing anti-science about waiting for long-term safety data before deciding whether or not to consume a brand new drug, I had a complaint filed against my license by left-wing activists accusing me of being anti-vaccine. I always thought that the Democrats were the party of the working class, but in every Democrat-run state, the COVID response seemed designed to harm the working class. Why were middle-class people with good healthcare benefits and statistically better baseline health being sequestered at home while poor people ran their errands and delivered their groceries and prepared their takeout meals? Young, healthy liberals working from home or collecting inflated unemployment payments took to social media and screeched, "Stay the fuck home," while 60-year-old diabetics continued working at grocery stores and as hospital janitors and in other high viral risk environments. The classism was so glaring, but every time I broached the topic in left-wing circles, I was accused of wanting people to die. Small businesses were destroyed, while Democrat governors allowed big box stores to remain open. My concerns about small business closures and the inevitable hyperinflation that we all knew would result from the government printing so much money were met with, "You sound like a Republican." I could easily continue about the horrors of the COVID response, but I'll leave it at this. By the end of 2020, after watching the left use public health as a societal wrecking ball, I found myself in agreement with Ronald Reagan. The scariest words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." It has not been easy for me to acknowledge I agree with Ronald Reagan about anything. Having been raised in a right-wing home, I'm well aware of grave problems on that side of the political spectrum. But after rejecting the right, like outright rejecting the right, for most of my life, I now see the value in many conservative principles. How did the left move from question authority to trust the science? How did liberals become so allegiant to big pharma and industrial medicine? Despite my relatively recent awakening to the phenomenon, left-wing medical totalitarianism has been going on a long time. It was liberal hero Oliver Wendell Holmes who wrote in the 1927 Buck versus Bell decision that the legal principle upholding compulsory vaccination was broad enough to cover the cutting of the fallopian tubes. And that's statute, the Buck versus Bell decision has never been overturned. That's still the law of the land in the United States. So forced sterilization is, of course, a bad look. It's much better to get people to believe they are choosing to go along with a population control program being pushed on them. The medicalization of leftism really took off with the sexual revolution. Women and girls were convinced that the pharmaceutical industry freed them from the fate of barefoot and pregnant domestic servitude. Temporary chemical sterilization was sold as sexual freedom, and with this has come the normalization of severe endocrine disruption in women. Rarely are girls and women informed of the risks of chemical contraception, risks that range from weight gain to strokes and lethal blood clots. Hardly anyone mentions that one of the most common side effects of chemical birth control is loss of libido and loss of female sexual response. I would argue that it has been men who primarily benefited from the mainstreaming of chemical birth control. The assumption that girls and women are taking drugs to turn off their fertility, combined with the online porn epidemic, has led to a poisonous new era of male sexual entitlement. Just as the women's liberation movement was hijacked by big pharma, the gay liberation movement also became devoted to industrial medicine. The drugs that transformed AIDS from a death sentence to a chronic manageable disease were arguably miraculous. These same drugs are now being pushed by public health under the term PrEP, pre-exposure prophylaxis, to enable gay and bisexual men to have casual sex without condoms and avoid HIV infection. Between the PrEP drugs and the relentless promotion of IUDs and implants, or, as I have heard public health workers describe them, birth control that does not require user responsibility, casual sex is the norm and condom use is considered passé. And unsurprisingly, the United States is now experiencing an exponential surge in syphilis cases. The transgender epidemic has further accelerated the medicalization of the left. Puberty blockers, pediatric mastectomies, genital mutilation, and a lifetime of cross-sex hormones are all celebrated as social justice victories. I routinely receive guidance from professional associations on trans-inclusive language, to avoid trans-exclusive. I've been told to refer to women as birthing bodies, to call vaginas front holes, which is so, that one in particular drives me insane because physiologically the vagina is the middle hole. And to call breastfeeding, chest feeding, and body feeding. Our youth are subject to relentless marketing of transgenderism, and most states with Democrat majorities have passed laws making it illegal for healthcare providers to discourage what is called gender-affirming care. If a 13-year-old patient tells me she wants to stop puberty, never get another period, and cut her breasts off, I risk losing my license if I don't refer her to a gender clinic and instead try to treat the roots of her distress. From my perspective, leftist values in medicine normalize pathology. Individual responsibility is considered a right-wing and even racist ideal, and that has no place in the current public health arena. All health problems are the fault of society and systemic oppression, and are never to be viewed as the result of individual choices and behaviors. Healthcare providers are now even being re-educated that it is ableist of us to believe that it is better to be healthy than to be sick. We are witnessing what I now view as not just acceptance, but promotion of chronic disease. Liberal pandemic policies directly and predictably led to massive weight gain, germophobia, agoraphobia, and suicidality in both children and adults. I have yet to see any remediation efforts from the public health community on these issues, but I do notice a trend where liberal public health celebrities unironically list their mental illness labels in their Twitter bios. Mainstream health magazines are pushing fat acceptance, and in March of this year, MSNBC and The Guardian ran articles asserting that gyms and fitness culture are recruiting grounds for right-wing extremism. I hope that people currently on the left can wake up from the hoodwinking and understand that Big Pharma is a force wanting to turn every human on the planet into a daily pharmaceutical customer. I don't want to live in a future where we are all chronically ill wards of the state. Unless the pendulum swings back toward ideals of individual responsibility and self-reliance, I fear that is where we are going.